Have you ever sat across from someone you thought you knew, maybe a family member, maybe a longtime friend, and suddenly felt something shift in your gut? They smile, they speak kindly, yet something about their presence unsettles you. It's as if the warmth of their words doesn't match the energy behind their eyes. That moment of unease, that quiet voice inside whispering, something isn't right. That's where our journey begins. Not every face that looks friendly belongs to a friend, and not every hand that reaches for you is meant to lift you higher. Sometimes, what we call friendship or family bond hides something far more dangerous, an energy that drains you, manipulates you, or holds you back from becoming who you truly are. Buddhist wisdom teaches us that the people we meet are mirrors of our karma. Some mirrors reflect love, compassion, and growth. Others reflect fear, jealousy, and attachment. And among them, there are those who carry the weight of their own unresolved suffering so heavy that it spills onto you, disguising itself as care, as closeness, as loyalty. But beneath the surface, it becomes poison. Think about it. How many times have you walked away from a conversation with someone you trust and yet felt tired, confused, or strangely guilty? Nothing harsh was said, nothing obvious happened, and yet your spirit was dimmed. That is no coincidence. In Zen practice, we are taught to trust the silent alarm inside, the body's way of sensing when energy is misaligned, when the smile in front of you hides something darker behind it. Now, I want to be clear. When we speak of demons here, we're not talking about creatures with horns and fire. The real demons are far more subtle. They live in patterns of manipulation, in hidden envy, in the constant erosion of your peace. They're not out there in the shadows. They show up at family dinners, in friendly conversations, in the people who claim they only want the best for you. And this is why awareness is so important. When you don't see them, you give them power. When you see them, you take your power back. The Buddha once said, "Nothing can harm you as much as your own unguarded thoughts." But the same is true for relationships. Nothing can harm you as much as the people you allow into your sacred space without discernment. This introduction is not meant to scare you. It's meant to wake you up. Because if you've ever felt that quiet unease, that strange mismatch between words and energy, you're not imagining it. You're being invited to see clearly, to protect your heart, and to live in alignment with truth rather than illusion. And as we move forward, we'll dive deeper into the hidden signs, those subtle red flags that show when a so-called friend or loved one isn't nurturing your soul but feeding on it. Some will be obvious once you recognize them. Others will surprise you because they're disguised as love, loyalty, or even selflessness. But all of them share one thing: they keep you from walking your true path in peace. So take a breath, settle your mind, and open your awareness. Because from here, the journey isn't just about spotting demons in others, it's about reclaiming the light in yourself. You've felt it before. You sit with someone, maybe over a meal, maybe during a phone call, maybe even just for a short visit, and when it's over, you're exhausted. Not the kind of tired that comes from physical work, but a deep, invisible drain, as if life itself has been quietly siphoned from you. What's strange is nothing dramatic seems to happen. No yelling, no conflict, no insult. On the surface, it's just another interaction. Yet when you leave, your body feels heavy, your mind foggy, and your heart restless. That's the first sign you've been in the presence of someone who doesn't feed your spirit, they feed on it. Buddhism teaches that all beings exchange energy. In every conversation, in every interaction, there is a subtle giving and receiving. When two people are aligned in kindness, compassion, or joy, that exchange feels uplifting. You laugh together, share honestly, and both walk away lighter. But when someone is carrying unresolved anger, jealousy, or emptiness, they unconsciously pull from the energy of others to survive. They don't know how to generate peace within, so they consume the peace of those around them. Think of it like a candle. When you're with someone healthy for your soul, it's as if your flame and theirs join, making the light brighter for both. But when you're with someone who drains you, their candle isn't lit. Instead of lighting their wick from your flame, they cover your candle with their hands, dimming it just enough to feel warmer themselves, while leaving you in the dark. Have you noticed that certain people only come to you when they need something? Maybe not money, maybe not favors, but energy. They talk and talk, circling around their problems, never listening, never changing. And when you finally part ways, you realize you've given them hours of your time and half of your spirit. Meanwhile, they walk away lighter, even smiling, while you stumble back into your own life drained and depleted. This is not compassion, it's consumption. True compassion is mutual. Even when you comfort someone, even when you listen to their pain, there's an unspoken balance. You give, they receive, and in their gratitude, you also feel nourished. But with an energy drainer, gratitude never comes. They just take, again and again, until you forget what your own peace feels like. The Buddha warned about this when he spoke of unwholesome company, not because we should judge or condemn others, but because the state of our minds is precious. Just as we protect our body from harmful food, we must protect our spirit from harmful company. If food can poison the body, the wrong company can poison the soul. But here's the challenge. These people don't announce themselves as toxic. They often appear caring, even friendly. They might even call you their best listener, or tell you how much they appreciate your presence. And yet the proof is in how you feel after they leave. That's the real test. So what do? First, you learn to trust your body's wisdom. If you consistently walk away from someone feeling weaker than before, that is your truth speaking. Don't dismiss it. Second, you establish boundaries, not from anger, but from self-respect. You don't have to be available every time they call. You don't have to sit through endless conversations that go nowhere. Protecting your energy is not selfish, it's spiritual hygiene. And third, you shift your compassion. Instead of endlessly giving yourself to someone who refuses to heal, you direct that compassion inward. You nourish your own spirit through meditation, through stillness, through connection with those who uplift you. Because the more you preserve your light, the more you'll have to shine for those who are truly ready to receive it. Energy drainers will always exist. They are not your enemy. They are simply lost in their own suffering, unaware of how much they depend on others to fill what's missing within. But you don't have to let their emptiness become your emptiness. You can acknowledge their struggle, even send them loving kindness in meditation without sacrificing your peace. And when you learn to guard your energy, something remarkable happens. You begin to notice the people who actually nourish you, the ones who leave you inspired, grounded, and alive. You'll see more clearly the difference between those who take and those who give. And with that clarity, your circle begins to change, not because you push people away, but because you naturally gravitate toward relationships that help you grow. The journey to spotting hidden demons begins here, with the quiet recognition of how someone affects your energy. Once you trust that awareness, the next layers of truth begin to reveal themselves. Because draining your spirit is only one mask they wear. There are others, more subtle, more deceptive, waiting to be uncovered. If draining your energy leaves you tired, then there's another kind of presence that goes even deeper. People who don't just leave you exhausted, but who quietly build their survival around your emotions. They don't simply take your energy for a moment. They hook themselves into your heart and feed off it again and again. These are what I call emotional parasites. They disguise themselves as friends, partners, or even family, but the truth is, their connection with you is not about love, it's about dependence. They can't sit with their own pain, so they turn you into the container for it. Have you noticed how some people only show up when they're drowning in crisis? They call you late at night, they pour out their drama, and suddenly your calm evening turns into their storm. And the next day they feel lighter because they've transferred the weight onto you. You carry their sadness, their fear, their worry, while they walk away relieved. It sounds harsh, but this is how parasites work. They survive by attaching themselves to a host. They don't destroy you completely because they need you alive, but they keep you just weak enough that you can continue to feed them. In emotional terms, it means they never want you strong enough to set boundaries, because then their supply would be cut off. In Buddhist teachings, compassion is essential, but compassion without wisdom turns into self-destruction. The Buddha never taught us to become containers for endless suffering. He taught us to help where we can, but never at the cost of losing ourselves. If someone repeatedly empties their suffering onto you without ever taking steps to grow, that's not healing, that's exploitation. Think of how a friend in true pain behaves. They come to you, they share, they're vulnerable, but they also listen. They appreciate your presence, and in their gratitude, you too feel nourished. Even in their sadness, there is an exchange, a flow of humanity that uplifts both of you. That is love. Now contrast that with the parasite. They come to you again and again, not to heal, but to unload. They don't change, they don't listen, and if you try to guide them toward solutions, they resist. Why? Because solving their problem would mean losing their excuse to keep feeding off your emotional strength. It's a harsh truth, but one that liberates you once you see it. Not everyone who cries on your shoulder is seeking healing. Some are seeking shelter so they never have to face their own storm. So how do you protect yourself? First, recognize the pattern. If someone's presence leaves you carrying burdens that were never yours, you're not imagining it. Second, shift your role. You are not a dumping ground, you are a mirror. Instead of absorbing their pain, reflect it back with clarity. Offer guidance, but don't carry what isn't yours. Third, let silence be your shield. Parasites thrive on constant access. When you step back, when you stop responding instantly, when you reclaim your time, they feel the gap, and that gap forces them to confront themselves. Buddhist wisdom calls this upekkha, equanimity. It means you can care for someone without drowning in their suffering. You send them compassion, but you don't lose your balance. You remain steady, like a tree in the wind. The storm may rage around you, but your roots are deep, your center unshaken. And here's something beautiful. Once you learn to guard your emotions, you'll realize how many of your relationships were built on one-sided pain. You'll begin to see who truly values your heart and who only values the relief they get from leaning on it. This awareness doesn't just protect you, it frees you. Because when you stop feeding parasites, you start feeding your own soul. And that's when you become strong enough to recognize the next mask. The people who don't drain you through sadness or crisis, but who quietly plant division in your world. They don't take your energy directly. Instead, they use your relationships as the battlefield. And if you're not aware, you'll find yourself isolated, doubting, and broken, all without ever realizing who lit the match. Sometimes the most dangerous people in your life aren't the ones who shout at you or drain you openly. They are the ones who work in whispers. They don't take your energy directly. They poison the space around you. They plant tiny seeds of doubt, subtle hints, quiet remarks, until one day you look up and realize the people you trusted most are now standing far away from you. This is the power of division, and for those who wear the mask of a friend or family member but carry the heart of a demon, division is their sharpest weapon. Think about it. A parasite needs your emotions to feed, but a divider needs your isolation to control. As long as you are connected, supported, and surrounded by love, you are strong. But if they can pull you away from others, if they can turn your circle against itself, then they don't even need to fight you directly. You've already been weakened. Have you ever noticed how a single sentence dropped at the right moment can create weeks of tension? I heard she said something about you. You know, he doesn't really respect you. I just want you to be careful. I don't think they're truly on your side. These comments may sound protective, even caring, but they work like slow poison. One remark creates suspicion, suspicion grows into distance, and distance eventually turns into silence. Buddhism teaches us that harmony is the foundation of strength. The Buddha spoke often about Sangha, the community of practitioners, because he knew that unity protects the mind. When we are connected in trust and compassion, negativity has no room to grow. But dividers know this too. That's why they attack your harmony, not your heart directly. They know that if they can break your connections, they can break your spirit. The trick is, they almost never look like the enemy. They may come across as concerned friends. They frame their gossip as advice. They position themselves as the only person you can trust, slowly making you depend on them while mistrusting everyone else. And once you're isolated, they hold the strings. It's like a spider weaving a web. The fly doesn't even realize it's being trapped until its wings can no longer move. So how do you spot this weapon of division? Look for patterns. Does someone consistently highlight the flaws of others, but rarely their goodness? Do they always warn you, but never celebrate your relationships? Do you notice that conversations with them leave you doubting people you once trusted? These are not coincidences. These are strategies. And here's the painful truth. People who divide often thrive on your conflict. When you argue with others, when you distance yourself, when you feel alone, they feel powerful. They've succeeded without lifting a hand, simply by using words as weapons. But remember this, truth has a way of shining through. Lies and half-truths only work when you don't look closely. The moment you pause, breathe, and examine the situation with clarity, the illusion falls apart. That's why mindfulness is so critical. In Zen, we practice awareness not only of the breath, but of the subtle intentions behind words. When you listen deeply, you don't just hear what's being said, you feel why it's being said. Protecting yourself from division doesn't mean confronting everyone who gossips. It means strengthening your roots. Stay grounded in your own direct experiences with people, not in someone else's whispers. If a friend has always been kind to you, don't let another's concern erase years of trust. If a family member has always shown loyalty, don't let suspicion grow from a single comment. Let your own awareness, not someone else's agenda, guide your judgment. Because once you see how division works, you'll realize something powerful. The true goal of these hidden demons is not to break your relationships, it's to break your sense of belonging. And when you guard that, when you keep your heart open to genuine connection, their weapon loses its edge. And yet, division is only one of the masks. Some don't stop at isolating you. They go further, weaving webs not only of gossip but of illusion. They make you question not just your relationships but your very sense of reality. And when that happens, the battle is no longer outside. It's inside your own mind. There's a kind of shadow that doesn't come in anger and doesn't come in whispers of division. It hides behind a smile. On the surface, it looks like celebration. It sounds like support. But if you listen closely, if you feel carefully, you'll notice the warmth is missing. What you're hearing is not joy, it's envy dressed as joy. You've seen it before. You share your success, a new achievement, a dream finally coming true. And they smile, they clap, they even say the right words. I'm so happy for you. But something inside you senses the truth. Their eyes don't match their mouth. Their embrace feels cold. Their words are heavy, as if each compliment costs them a little too much. That's envy at work. Unlike open hostility, envy rarely attacks directly. It doesn't shout. It doesn't argue. It simply refuses to celebrate you. And in its more deceptive form, it pretends to celebrate while secretly resenting. The Buddha once compared jealousy to a fire that burns the one who carries it before it ever reaches another. But here's the danger. When envy is hidden beneath false joy, that fire still radiates outward. You can feel it even if you can't explain it. Their words encourage you, but their energy discourages you. Their presence makes your victory feel smaller, less alive. Why do they do this? Because envy cannot stand to see others shine. To the envious heart, your success feels like their failure. Your joy reminds them of what they lack. And instead of using that discomfort to grow, they cover it with a mask, pretending to cheer while secretly hoping you stumble. And the mask works, at least for a while. Because who would suspect a smiling face? Who would doubt words of encouragement? That's why envy hidden behind false joy is so insidious. It makes you question yourself. You wonder if you're being paranoid, if you're imagining the hollowness in their voice. But deep down, your intuition knows. So how do you protect yourself? First, trust your inner sense. Joy is contagious. When someone is truly happy for you, you feel lifted. If instead you feel smaller, dimmer, uncertain after sharing your success, that's not joy, it's envy in disguise. Second, stop seeking validation from those who can't give it. If you know someone struggles with envy, don't hand them your victories to measure. Share your light with those who reflect it back, not those who quietly try to dim it. This isn't arrogance, it's wisdom. Protecting your joy is as important as protecting your peace. Third, respond with compassion but not dependence. Envious people are trapped in their own prison. They can't celebrate you because they haven't learned to celebrate themselves. That doesn't mean you need to shrink to make them comfortable. It means you acknowledge their suffering without letting it steal your light. Because here's the truth: joy is sacred. It's not meant to be negotiated or diluted. When the Buddha spoke of mudita, sympathetic joy, he described the ability to truly celebrate the happiness of others. That is spiritual maturity. To smile not only when life blesses you, but also when it blesses someone else. When you find people capable of this, treasure them. They are rare, they are gold. But when you encounter the mask of false joy, don't be fooled. A smile can lie, but energy never does. Learn to trust the difference. And as you do, you'll begin to see how many faces wear masks. Not just envy, but manipulation, control, even charm. Each mask hides a deeper hunger. And unless you learn to see past the surface, you may find yourself entangled in their illusions, doubting what's real and what's false. Envy hides behind false joy, but there's another mask even more dangerous, the mask of closeness. Some people don't steal your energy with sadness, and they don't divide you with whispers. Instead, they step so far into your life that you forget where you end and they begin. And by the time you realize it, your boundaries are no longer yours. Boundaries are sacred. They are the invisible lines that protect your peace, your time, your values. They are the walls that keep your soul from being trampled. But to those who cannot respect them, boundaries are seen not as protection but as obstacles. And obstacles in their mind are meant to be crossed. It starts small. A friend who always insists on knowing every detail of your private life. A family member who enters your space without asking. A partner who demands your time even when you clearly need rest. They call it love. They say it's just care. But deep inside, you feel the weight. This isn't closeness, it's intrusion. The Buddha once taught that a balanced life is one that honors the middle way. Balance is impossible without boundaries. Just as the river needs its banks to flow, your life needs its limits to remain steady. Without them, what you have leaks away: your time, your energy, your sense of self. But when people cross your boundaries, notice how they react if you resist. Do they respect your no, or do they push harder? Do they guilt you, saying, "After everything I've done for you"? Do they shame you with, "You've changed, you don't care anymore"? These aren't the words of someone who loves you. These are the words of someone who believes your life belongs to them. And this is the truth many don't want to face. Love without respect for boundaries is not love, it's control. Real love gives space. It honors individuality. It listens when you say, "This is where I stop." So how do you reclaim your boundaries once they've been broken? First, remember that saying no is not cruelty, it's clarity. A no spoken with truth is more loving than a yes spoken with resentment. Second, practice detachment. When you stop reacting to guilt and manipulation, their power over you weakens. Third, surround yourself with people who understand balance. The ones who know that closeness and respect can coexist. In Zen practice, there is a saying, "The moon lives in the sky, the waves live in the sea, close enough to touch but never crossing their nature." That is how true connection works. Deep intimacy without violation. Care without control. And when you learn this, you'll see clearly, every boundary that is crossed without respect is a signal. A signal that you are dealing not with love, but with someone who feeds on possession. And once you see that, you are ready for the next mask. The one that doesn't simply break your boundaries, but twists your reality. They don't just invade your space, they rewrite your truth. There's a moment more unsettling than someone crossing your boundaries. It's when they step inside your life so deeply that they begin to shape the way you see yourself. They don't just invade your space, they invade your reflection. They become a false mirror. Think about it. A real mirror shows you as you are. It doesn't judge, it doesn't distort, it simply reflects. That's what true friends and loving family do. They hold up a mirror so you can see yourself clearly, even when you forget your worth. But a false mirror doesn't reflect you back, it reshapes. It shows you not who you are, but who they want you to believe you are. At first, it seems harmless. They may compliment you, but always with a twist. You're smart, but not as smart as him. Or, you're beautiful, though you could really lose some weight. Their words are laced with comparison, with subtle cuts that weaken your self-image. And you start to wonder, maybe they are right. Maybe I'm not enough. This is how the false mirror works. It distorts until you no longer trust your own reflection. It chips away at your confidence, leaving you dependent on their approval, always searching their face to know whether you are valuable or not. The Buddha taught that clinging to false views is one of the deepest sources of suffering. And this is exactly what happens when you live by a distorted reflection. You suffer under illusions. Instead of living as your true self, you become trapped in their version of you. But notice the pattern. False mirrors rarely celebrate your strengths without conditions. They praise you only when it serves their control, only when it keeps you seeking their validation. And when you grow, when you shine too brightly, the mirror shifts again, suddenly showing only your flaws, reminding you why you should not stand too tall. This is not reflection. This is manipulation. So how do you free yourself from a false mirror? First, learn to trust your own eyes. Your value does not require confirmation from anyone else. Second, surround yourself with people who reflect light, not shadows. A true mirror lifts you even when you stumble and loves you even when you don't shine. Third, remember the practice of mindfulness. The more aware you are of your thoughts, the quicker you'll notice when those thoughts don't actually belong to you, but were planted there by someone else's distortion. And here's the most powerful truth. You were never meant to be defined by another person's reflection. You are not a distorted image. You are the source of the light itself. And once you realize that, the false mirrors crack. They can no longer hold power over the way you see yourself. But when those mirrors shatter, when you begin to rise with clarity, another mask often appears, one that doesn't just distort your reflection, but actively punishes you for outgrowing the role they created for you. They don't just want to shape you, they want to chain you. When a false mirror cracks, something dangerous often follows. The moment you begin to see yourself clearly, when you start breaking free from their distorted reflection, they reach for another weapon: guilt. Guilt is heavier than anger, quieter than envy, but far more binding. It doesn't shout, it whispers, it doesn't strike, it chains. And before you know it, you are no longer trapped by their opinions. You are shackled by your own conscience, twisted against you. You've felt it before, the sigh that comes after you say no. The words that cut deeper because they sound so reasonable, after all I've done for you. Or the subtle silence that makes you feel like you've betrayed them by simply choosing yourself. This is how guilt works. It turns your strength into selfishness, your independence into betrayal, your self-care into cruelty. But here's the truth. Love that demands guilt is not love, it's leverage. Real care never needs to bind you. It gives freely, without expecting chains in return. The Buddha warned of clinging, not just to desires, but to obligations that are born from fear rather than compassion. Guilt is one of those bindings. It is a false debt, written not in truth but in manipulation. And those who wield it know its power. They know that a heart filled with compassion is easily manipulated, easily made to believe that setting boundaries is cruelty and walking your own path is abandonment. But guilt, when examined, falls apart. Ask yourself, am I truly responsible for their happiness? Is my no really harm, or is it simply me protecting my peace? More often than not, guilt reveals itself for what it is, a tool to keep you small, compliant, and chained. Breaking those chains begins with awareness. The moment you recognize guilt as manipulation, it loses half its weight. The other half falls away when you stand firm in your truth. Saying, I love you, but I will not carry this burden for you is not cruelty. It is clarity. It is freedom. And remember this, compassion is not about sacrificing yourself endlessly. The Buddha spoke of the middle path for a reason. True compassion includes compassion for yourself. If helping another destroys your peace, that help is no longer pure. So when guilt comes dressed as love, see it for what it is, a shackle, not a gift. And once you break it, you reclaim not only your freedom, but your joy. Yet for some, the moment you slip free of guilt, They reach for the last and most desperate tactic: fear. If guilt cannot chain you, fear will try to cage you. They will no longer settle for whispers, they will roar. Sometimes the most powerful warning isn't spoken in words, it's felt in silence. You walk into a room and nothing is said, yet your stomach tightens. You sit across from someone you've known for years, and though they smile, something inside you whispers, "Be careful." This is the alarm that no one teaches us to trust, the unease with no apparent reason. It's the quiet signal from deep within, the body's way of telling you the soul senses danger long before the mind has evidence. We often dismiss it. We call ourselves paranoid, too sensitive, dramatic. After all, there's no proof, no harsh words, no open hostility. Just a strange weight in the air, a sudden urge to withdraw, an instinct telling you something doesn't align. But if you've ever ignored that voice, you know the price. Because unease is rarely wrong. It's your intuition, sharpened by countless generations of survival, speaking a truth that logic has not yet caught up to. The Buddha spoke of mindfulness as the art of seeing clearly, but he also taught that clarity is not only of the eyes, it is of the heart. Sometimes the heart feels what the eyes cannot see. Unease, then, is not weakness, it is awareness. It is a signal: look deeper, pay attention, something here is hidden. Why is this feeling so important? Because those who wear masks, false joy, false mirrors, chains of guilt, are masters of appearances. They know how to smile at the right moment, how to speak the right words, how to make the surface look calm while underneath lies turbulence. And if you rely only on appearances, you will be deceived. But unease cuts through appearances. It is your spirit detecting what the senses miss. Think of it this way. When you hear music slightly out of tune, you don't need to be a musician to notice something is wrong. Your body reacts. Unease works the same way. It's the dissonance of energy, the mismatch between what is shown and what is true. So, how do you respond when unease arises? First, you honor it. You don't dismiss it, you don't shame yourself for feeling it. Second, you investigate quietly. Watch their actions more than their words. Do they drain you after every interaction? Do they thrive when you doubt yourself? Do they seem pleased when you are small and unsettled when you shine? These are not coincidences, they are confirmations. Third, and most importantly, you prepare to step away if the pattern continues. Because unease is not just a signal of danger, it's also a reminder of choice. You don't need permission to protect your peace. You don't need proof to honor your intuition. And here's the final truth. Those who truly love you will never make you feel unsafe in their presence. Love calms. Love steadies. Love is the absence of fear. If someone's energy constantly leaves you unsettled, no matter what mask they wear, that is your soul telling you, this is not love. This is not safe. When you listen to that signal, you break free not only from them, but from the greatest illusion of all, the belief that danger must be visible to be real. Sometimes the invisible is the clearest truth of all. And as this awareness grows, you begin to see everything differently. You no longer just watch their actions, you feel the energy behind them. You no longer just hear their words, you sense the silence in between. This is where the journey leads, to the final awakening. The moment you no longer just survive among masks, but step beyond them completely. Love is the most powerful force in life. It can heal what feels broken, soften what has grown hard, and remind us that even in darkness, light exists. But love without wisdom becomes fragile. It opens the door not only to connection, but also to wounds. And so the deepest practice is this, to learn how to love without being destroyed by it. All throughout this journey, we've seen the many masks that people can wear. Masks of envy, control, false mirrors, guilt, and unease. And yet the answer is not to harden your heart, nor to close the gates of your soul. The answer is balance, to open your heart wide enough to give love freely, but strong enough to protect it when love is twisted into something else. The Buddha taught that compassion without wisdom can drown, while wisdom without compassion can freeze. But together they form the middle path, love that is warm yet steady, Love that is kind, yet unshakable. This is how we love without losing ourselves. What does that look like in practice? It is saying, I care for you, but I will not carry what is yours to bear. It is saying, I forgive you, but I will not allow you to harm me again. It is choosing to give from fullness, not from depletion. It is loving with open hands, not with chains. And when you live this way, you discover a secret. Love is not meant to be a prison. It is meant to be a liberation. True love, whether from friends, family, or partners, never leaves you drained. It leaves you whole. It doesn't cloud your reflection. It helps you see yourself more clearly. It doesn't bind you with guilt. It lifts you with joy. It doesn't create unease. It deepens peace. So perhaps the greatest teaching of all is this. You don't need to stop loving to stay safe. You only need to love wisely, with compassion for others, yes, but also with compassion for yourself. Because at the end of the day, love is not about losing yourself in someone else. It is about finding yourself more deeply through the act of giving and receiving. And as you walk this path, remember, love with openness but also with boundaries. Love with tenderness but also with strength. Love, not as a wound to endure but as a light to share. If these words touched something in you, if they reminded you of truths you had almost forgotten, then carry them with you. Let them guide you. Let them protect you. Let them soften your path. And if you wish to walk deeper into these teachings, into the wisdom of Zen and the peace it offers, I invite you to stay connected. If this resonated with you, subscribe to Zen Buddhism Wisdom for more reflections like this. Share this video with someone who may need it. And remember, your journey is your own, but you are never walking it alone. May you love fully without fear. May you love wisely without wounds. And may every step you take bring you closer to peace.